Alright, well, welcome to this little short lesson on solving quadratic equations, specifically quadratic equations when you only have an x squared and no x, just x squared. It's pretty straightforward. When there's not an x and just an x squared involved, all we want to do is to get the x squared alone on one side, and then to remember that when we're solving equations, we use inverses. What's the inverse or the opposite of squaring something? It is to take the square root. So this one is set up perfectly for us. We have x squared equals 35, and so to get rid of that x squared, we do the opposite and take the square root of both sides. One thing it is super important to remember is anytime you're solving an equation, you take the square root of both sides. You have to take into account the fact that you have a positive and a negative possibility for your answer. So what we do is we put plus or minus in front of that. 35 is not a perfect square. It means it doesn't have a whole number square root. And there's not a perfect square that divides into it. The only way to get 35 is 35 times 1 or 5 times 7. So this is our simplified answer. Our two answers are the square root of 35 and the other is the negative square root of 35. The reason we have to do both is because both of those, if we squared them, would equal a positive 35, because for this negative, the negative times negative makes that positive. Okay, so it's very important that you remember to do that. When you're solving an equation and you take the square root of both sides to solve it, you need to put that plus or minus there, unless the problem states specifically that you wouldn't need to do that. Okay, so here is another example. Again, notice that we have just x squared. There is no plain x's. So what we want to do is get the x squared alone on one side. So I'm going to go ahead and divide both sides by 5 here so that I've totally isolated the x squared. And that gives me that x squared is equal to 36. And then again, we're trying to isolate the x. The only problem with it now is that it's squared. To get rid of squares, we take the square root, not forgetting to put the plus or minus there. And we get x equals 36 does have a square root. The square root of 36 is 6. So our two solutions are, the first is positive 6 and the second is negative 6. You can always go back up and check that. If I were to put 6 in my original equation for x, 6 squared would be 36, and 5 times 36 is indeed 180. The same for negative 6. Negative 6 squared is positive 36 times 5 is 180. Again, don't forget that plus or minus when you're taking the square root of both sides to solve. Here is one last example. So this time again, we look at the equation and we go, oh, it's an x squared, so it's quadratic. So from here, what do I do? And you notice, oh, I only have an x squared, I don't have an x. So my job is to first isolate the x squared. So I'm going to add 12 to both sides. And I get 3x squared equals 12. And then divide both sides by 3. Now I have x squared is equal to 4. Last step, to get rid of an x squared and totally isolate that x, I take the square root. I do the opposite. Don't forget the plus or minus. That's the theme here. So x equals plus or minus the square root of 4, which the square root of 4 is 2, because 2 times 2 is 4. So my solutions are positive 2 and negative 2. Two answers to that problem.